in my scene I've got a player with a top-down player controller and a circle sprite for my enemy and bullet. So on our enemy, we're going to add a new script called Ranged Enemy Controller, and then open it up in Visual Studio. Once it's opened, we first need to define a few variables. The first one is a public float called move speed, and this will determine how fast our player can move. The second one is a public transform called player, and that's so we can reference the player's position within the scene. Then we need a public transform called shot point, and that's going to specify where we want our bullet to come from. And then after that, we want another public transform called gun, and this will act as the pivot point for the shot point to revolve around. After that, we need a public game object for the enemy projectile, and this is just going to be what the enemy fires. And then the last few variables that we need are a public float called follow range, a private boolean called in range, a public float called attack range, a public float called start time between shots, and then lastly, a private float called time between shots. We can go ahead and delete our start method as we won't be using this. So in our update method, we want to rotate the gun to point towards the player, and this involves quite a bit of maths, so I'll just say the lines needed and spare you the in-depth details. So first is vector3 difference equals player.position minus gun.transform.position. Then float rot_z equals mathf.atan2 difference.y difference.x times by mathf.rad2deg. And then lastly, gun.transform.rotation equals quaternion.euler 0 0 rot_z. After this, we want to check if the player is close enough for the enemy to follow, but is far enough away from the attack range. So to do this, we say, if vector2.distance transform.position is less than or equal to follow player range, and vector2.distance transform.position play.position is greater than attack range. If the player is within that range, then we want to set in range equal to true. However, if the player is outside of this range, then we want to set in range equal to false. After this, we want to check if the player is in range to be shot at. To do this, we can type if vector2.distance transform.position play.position is less than or equal to attack range. If the player is in this range, then we want to check if time between shots is less than or equal to 0, which, if it is, then we want to instantiate enemy projectile at shotpoint.position with the rotation of shotpoint.transform.rotation. And then, underneath this, we just want to set time between shots equals start time between shots. However, if time between shots is greater than 0, then we want to say else time between shots minus equals time.delta time. After this, we're going to create a fixed update method, and in here we're going to check if in range, and then we want to say transform.position equals vector2.move towards transform.position player.position move speed times by time.delta time. And then finally, just for a bit of convenience, and then lastly for a bit of convenience, we can create a onDraw gizmos and say gizmos.draw wiresphere at transform.position follow player range, gizmos.color equals color.red, gizmos.draw wiresphere transform.position attack range. And this will allow us to see our ranges in the editor. That's it for the enemy script, so save it and head back into Unity. Once back in Unity, go over to our bullet and we want to add a new script called bullet script. Once that's created, open it up in Visual Studio. Once it's opened, we need to create a few variables. The first one is a public float called bullet speed, and this will determine how fast we want our projectile to move. And then we want a public float called lifetime. In our start method, we want to invoke destroyed projectile after lifetime. Then we want to change our update method into a fixed update and say transform.translate vector2.write times by bullet speed times by time.delta time. And then finally, we just want to create a new method called destroy projectile, destroy game object. And then that's it for the bullet script, so save it and then head back into Unity. On our bullet, we can set the bullet speed to something like 5 and its lifetime to something like 2. And then drag our bullet into our asset browser to create a prefab of it. Then on our enemy, we want to set the move speed to something like 3 drag and drop our player into the player slot, right click on our ranged enemy, create an empty object and call this gun, and then right click on gun, create another empty object and call this shot point. And then for the shot point, we want to drag and drop that shot point empty we just created. And then for the gun, we want to do the exact same thing. Once you've done that, go ahead and drag out the shot point ever so slightly, just so it's not overlapping with the enemy. For our follow play range, we want to set this to something like 5, and our attack range to something like 3, and then time between shots to something like 0.25. After this, if we go ahead and click play, if our player moves within the range, our enemy starts to follow, and then if we get within the fire range, we can see our enemy stops and begins to shoot at the player. If you found this video helpful, please leave a like and consider subscribing for more game dev content, and as always, I'll see y'all later.